Grace had always lived a simple life. She came from a modest neighborhood where neighbors knew each other by name, and everyone helped one another in times of need. She had worked many years as a caretaker, looking after children of families who were often too busy to spend time with them. Though the work was hard and the hours long, Grace had always found joy in caring for children. She believed every child, no matter how rich or poor, needed love, patience, and someone who would listen. One morning, Grace received a call that changed her path. A well-dressed woman from a large agency told her about a job in a grand mansion on the edge of town. The family needed a nanny for a 6-year-old boy. Grace thought it was just another ordinary job until the woman lowered her voice and explained, "The boy hasn't spoken since birth." Many nannies tried, but none stayed long. Grace felt her heart stir. She didn't see the boy as a problem, she only thought of a child who must be lonely and misunderstood. Without hesitation, she accepted. The day she first arrived at the mansion, Grace felt out of place. The tall iron gates opened slowly, revealing a driveway lined with expensive cars and neatly trimmed gardens. The house itself looked like a palace with high white walls and shining windows. Grace carried her small bag, reminding herself that she had come to work, not to compare lives. She had promised herself she would show kindness to the boy, no matter how silent he was. Inside, the staff greeted her with polite but cold expressions. Some glanced at her plain clothes and then exchanged knowing looks. She understood what they were thinking, another nanny who would leave after a week. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, explained the rules sharply: meals at fixed times, no unnecessary noise in the halls, and always respect Mr. Carter's busy schedule. And about the boy, she added, he won't listen. Don't expect him to. Grace nodded quietly. She didn't need advice about children, she knew love took time. When she finally saw Daniel, the boy she had been hired to care for, her heart softened. He was small for his age, with curly hair falling over his eyes. He sat on the floor of his room, pushing toy cars back and forth, not looking at anyone. When she entered, he froze for a moment but did not raise his head. She spoke softly, as if she were speaking to a shy bird. "Hello, Daniel. My name is Grace. I'll be spending time with you." He gave no reply, not even a glance, but she was not discouraged. She walked over to the bookshelf, picked up a colorful storybook, and began reading aloud. Daniel did not move closer, but she noticed his little hands stopped moving the car for a moment. He was listening, even if he didn't show it. That became her way. Each morning, Grace would sit nearby and read stories in a calm, steady voice. Sometimes she hummed old songs her grandmother had taught her. At first, Daniel seemed distant, but slowly she saw tiny changes. When she read about animals, his eyes shifted toward the book. When she hummed, he tapped his fingers gently on his toy, almost like keeping rhythm. Grace celebrated these small signs in her heart. The rest of the staff thought she was wasting her time. "The boy doesn't need fairy tales," one maid whispered in the hallway. "He needs doctors and expensive therapy. This nanny won't last." But Grace didn't listen. She believed that even if Daniel never spoke, he still deserved affection. Days passed into weeks, and Grace began noticing patterns. Daniel never joined meals in the dining room, food was always sent to his room. He avoided eye contact with his father, Mr. Carter, who rarely came home before night. Grace realized Daniel's silence was more than a condition, it was a wall built out of loneliness. One afternoon, as rain tapped against the tall windows, Grace decided not to read a book. Instead, she simply sat on the floor near Daniel and began playing with blocks. She didn't ask him to join. She just built a small tower quietly. After a while, she heard the softest sound, the squeak of a toy car rolling closer to her. Daniel had moved it toward her tower. She smiled warmly, not saying a word. For the first time, they were playing side by side. Grace never pushed him. She understood that trust was fragile. Every day she gave him her steady presence, her gentle smile, her patience. Daniel began allowing her to sit closer. Sometimes, when she read, he leaned ever so slightly in her direction. She noticed his lips moving silently, as if he were trying to form words but couldn't let them out. Late at night, Grace often sat on her small bed in the servants' quarters, thinking of him. She remembered how her own children, now grown, once clung to her stories when they were little. She whispered a silent promise, "I will not give up on you, Daniel." The mansion remained filled with whispers and doubts, but Grace carried her quiet hope. She could see what others could not. Behind Daniel's silence was a child longing to be held, to be understood, and perhaps, one day, to speak. That was how their story began, two lives crossing in a house where money bought everything except the warmth of love. Grace did not yet know how deeply this bond would change her life. She only knew she was willing to wait, to sit patiently until Daniel decided to let her into his world. Grace woke before sunrise to start the day in quiet. She believed mornings set the tone for everything that came after. In the soft light of the kitchen, she poured tea and reviewed the small notes she had written about Daniel. She kept a simple notebook, nothing fancy, just dates and gentle observations, looked at the book cover for 3 seconds, tapped fingers to the song, pushed the car toward me. These were not big moments to other people, but to Grace they were precious steps. They were proof that Daniel was not a closed door, he was opening, even if only a tiny bit at a time. When she reached his room, Daniel was sitting by the window, watching the clouds. He liked the soft curtain, pulling it forward and letting it sway back, as if it were a little ocean wave. Grace walked in and said good morning in a warm voice. He did not respond, but he glanced at her hand for a second. She noticed this and kept her distance, moving slowly, giving him space. She set down a book with bright pictures of animals. She placed it not too close to him, not too far, just where he could see it if he wanted. The house ran like a clock. Meals at certain times. Staff moving with quiet feet. Phones ringing in the office down the hall. It should have felt peaceful, but there was a tightness in the air. Expectations lived in those high ceilings. Results were expected. Grace could feel it even when no one spoke. Mrs. Wilson came to the doorway and said, "Mr. Carter asked for an update later. Don't get your hopes up." Then she disappeared down the corridor, leaving a thin trail of doubt behind her words. Grace did not fight the doubt. She let it pass, like a bird flying across the sky. She opened the animal book and began to read in a calm rhythm. She did the voices softly, just enough to make the lion sound brave and the rabbit sound curious. Daniel's hand, which had been playing with the curtain, slowed. His eyes found the page where a giraffe bent its long neck to drink water. Grace smiled inside. She did not clap or cheer or make it a big thing. She simply turned the page and kept going, honoring the quiet moment as if it were a delicate flower. Later that morning, a driver came to take Daniel to a therapy session in the city. Grace had never met the therapist, but she had read the reports in the file that Mrs. Wilson handed her. The notes were full of numbers and charts. Words like goals and targets and benchmarks were everywhere. Grace appreciated the effort everyone had made, but she also knew something simple: a child's heart does not move by charts alone. It needs warmth and trust. During the drive, Daniel sat close to the window, tracing a circle on the glass with his fingertip. Grace sat beside him in the back seat, not crowding him. She hummed a little tune, the same one from yesterday, a tiny thread connecting the days. For a moment, she saw his shoulders loosen. The city streets slid by, grey and busy, and the car felt like a small island where only two people were learning how to be near each other without fear. At the clinic, the waiting room had smooth chairs and soft lights. The therapist greeted them kindly and asked questions that Grace tried to answer as well as she could. Then the session began. Grace sat in a corner while the therapist used tools and games to invite Daniel to engage. He did participate in small ways, but he looked over at Grace more than once, as if checking that she was still there. Every time, she nodded gently, and he settled again. When the session ended, the therapist came over and said, "He responds to your presence. That matters." Grace thanked her with quiet gratitude. Back at the mansion, staff moved around with their routines. A few of them made comments in the hallway that they likely thought Grace could not hear. "It's been weeks," someone whispered. "No change. He won't speak." Another voice replied, "He needs more than stories. He needs something stronger." Grace held her notebook tighter. She wanted to tell them that small steps were not nothing. But she also knew that arguing would not open their hearts. Only time, and the boy himself, could do that. That afternoon, Grace asked permission to take Daniel to the garden. The sky was clear, and the hedges smelled fresh. A gardener was working quietly, trimming rose bushes. Grace chose a wooden bench near the fountain and sat. Daniel stood, looking at the water, fascinated by the way it fell in a steady line and broke into tiny silver drops. Grace took a small bubble wand from her pocket. She had bought it on her day off with her own money. She dipped it in the soap and blew a single bubble. It rose in the air, round and soft, carrying a rainbow on its surface. Daniel's eyes followed it. When it popped, he blinked, surprised. Grace blew another, then another, in slow rhythm, letting the bubbles drift. Daniel reached out and tried to touch one. He missed, and the bubble popped, and he looked at his own hand with small wonder. The gardener paused and watched, a little smile hiding under his mustache. They stayed in the garden until the shadows grew longer. Grace noticed that when the breeze moved the trees, Daniel looked to the side where she sat, as if to check that she was not gone. That feeling of being trusted, even a little, filled her heart with quiet joy. On their way inside, Daniel brushed the back of her hand with his fingers. It was not an accident. It was a question, "Are you still here?" Grace answered without words, slowing her steps to walk beside him, letting their hands remain close but not forcing a hold. He relaxed. That evening, Mr. Carter returned early. This was unusual. He was tall, always in a suit, always on a call, always walking fast. But tonight he put his phone in his pocket and asked to see the notebook. Grace gave it to him with calm hands. He turned the pages, reading the small entries. She could see his face soften, then harden again, then soften once more. Feelings were not easy for him to show. "Has he said anything?" he asked, voice careful. "Not yet," Grace said. "But he is watching more. Listening more. Reaching a little. He looks to me for safety. That is a first step." He nodded, then looked past her to where Daniel was lining up toy cars on the rug. "I want the best for him," he said. "I don't always know how to give it." "You gave him a home," Grace said gently. "Now we give him a feeling that home is safe, and that takes time." He did not reply, but he did not argue. After a moment, he crouched down and picked up one of the cars, placing it at the end of Daniel's row. Daniel noticed and moved a car closer to where his father's had landed. It was not a game the way other children played, but it was a kind of connection. Grace watched this quiet moment and wrote it in her memory. Later that night, Grace sat at the small desk in her room and added to her notebook, "Garden bubbles. Reached for my hand. Looked for me in breeze." Father placed car, Daniel moved car closer. She underlined the last part. It felt important. Maybe the bridge between father and son could also grow, like the one between Daniel and her. The next day, everything felt fragile. Mrs. Wilson called a brief meeting and announced a new schedule, tighter than before. "There will be more sessions," she said. "We will measure progress weekly. Mr. Carter wants clear results." The staff nodded. Grace did not object to structure, but she worried that pressure might push Daniel back into his shell. She turned this over in her mind while folding laundry, smoothing each small t-shirt with careful hands. When she entered Daniel's room, he was sitting with a music box. She had not seen it before. Maybe it had been his mother's. It was painted with little stars and had a tiny key on the side. Daniel turned the key and let it play. The melody was simple and sweet, like a lullaby heard from another room. Grace sat on the floor and listened. She did not speak. She did not move. She let the music fill the space and waited for what it would bring. Daniel turned the key again when it stopped, and again after that. On the third time, he looked up and met her eyes for a moment, asking if it was okay to play it again. She nodded slowly. He turned the key with tiny, careful motions, as if the whole world could be kept safe if he kept the melody going. That afternoon, when the driver arrived for another session, Daniel hesitated at the door. He looked toward Grace, then toward the hallway, then back at her. It was as if he wanted to ask a question but did not have a voice for it. Grace took one step forward and held out her hand. Not a command. An invitation. After a small pause, he placed his hand in hers. His fingers were light and unsure, like a small bird resting for a moment. They walked to the car together. In the session, the therapist noticed the same thing Grace had felt. Daniel's courage grew when he felt secure. She suggested some gentle exercises Grace could repeat at home, things like mirroring hand movements, taking turns tapping on a table, and matching breaths to a soft count. These were not loud or dramatic tasks. They were tiny bridges built in silence. Grace thanked her and promised to practice with patience. Back home, the staff still whispered, but now a few of them had begun to watch the small changes more carefully. The gardener asked Grace, "Bubbles again tomorrow?" She smiled and said yes. The cook set aside a small bowl of strawberries because Daniel had eaten 2 at lunch and seemed to like the color. These were little kindnesses, but they mattered. A house can learn to be gentle, too. That evening, Mr. Carter came to the room once more. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Grace was tapping gently on a wooden block. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause. Daniel sat across from her and copied the pattern with his fingertips on the rug. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause. It was like 2 hearts learning to share a rhythm. Mr. Carter watched with a face that was trying not to hope too much. At last he asked, "May I try?" His voice was soft, almost shy. Grace nodded and handed him the block. He sat, awkward in his expensive suit, and made a clumsy pattern. Daniel looked at the block, then at his father's hand, then tapped his own fingers to respond. 1, 2, pause. Grace felt her eyes sting, not with sadness but with a kind of gentle relief. After Mr. Carter left, he spoke briefly to Grace in the hallway. "I've arranged for a review at the end of the month," he said. "Please continue what you're doing." He searched for words. "Thank you." Then he went down the stairs, slower than usual, as if the day had become heavier and somehow lighter at the same time. That night, a soft rain began outside, the kind that makes the whole world feel quieter. Grace checked on Daniel before bed. He was asleep, the music box on his nightstand. She wound it once and let it play low, then set her hand lightly on the blanket near his shoulder for a second. "Good night, little one," she whispered into the room, not to wake him, but to bless the space. In her own room, she wrote the final note of the day. "He took my hand." Practiced mirroring. Father joined tapping. House learning gentleness. She closed the notebook and pressed it to her heart. She knew the road ahead was still long. There would be days when progress hid itself and everyone would doubt again. But she also knew this: the boy who would not look at anyone now looked for her. The boy who would not join anyone in anything now tapped a pattern with his father. These were not small things. They were the shape of hope. As the rain whispered on the windows, Grace thought of the picture she had seen in a hallway frame, a young woman holding a baby in a garden, her smile bright and tender. She guessed it was Daniel's mother. Grace did not try to be that woman. She did not try to fill spaces that could never be replaced. She only offered what she had: steady hands, a patient voice, and a promise to stay. Somewhere deep within, she felt a quiet certainty grow, like a seed beneath the soil. Something was changing. Not loudly. Not all at once. But truly. And when morning came again, she woke with the same gentle purpose that had guided her since the first day: to show up, to listen, to wait, and to celebrate every small step that a child's brave heart chose to take. The days of quiet patience slowly built into something neither Grace nor the staff expected. Each morning she continued with her gentle routines, reading, humming, sitting nearby, never forcing Daniel, always waiting. The garden walks, the tapping games, the soft melodies of his music box, these became their little bridges. But one afternoon, something happened that would change the course of everything. It was a gray, rainy day, the kind where the whole world feels hushed. The staff moved through the house a little slower, the halls filled with the steady rhythm of raindrops against the tall windows. Grace entered Daniel's room to find him curled up near the corner, clutching the music box tightly. His small face looked troubled, his eyes heavy as if a bad dream had followed him into the waking hours. Grace approached softly. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. She sat on the rug beside him, not too close, but close enough to let him feel her presence. She noticed his shoulders trembling, his grip on the music box almost desperate. Without speaking another word, she hummed the tune from the box, slow and steady, until her voice filled the quiet room. At first, Daniel only stared at the floor. Then, to Grace's surprise, he shuffled a little closer, as though pulled by the safety of her voice. When the melody ended, he placed the box gently on her lap. His eyes lifted for a moment, uncertain, searching. Grace smiled warmly, her hand hovering just above his hair, not touching until she saw he was ready. He leaned ever so slightly, and she let her hand rest softly, giving comfort. Then it happened. His lips moved. At first, it was no sound, just the shape of a word. Grace leaned forward, her heart pounding. He tried again, and this time, a whisper came out. It was shaky, but clear enough: "Mommy." Grace froze, breath caught in her chest. She blinked, unsure if she had truly heard it. But then, Daniel said it again, stronger, looking right into her eyes this time: "Mommy." His voice was tender, broken by years of silence, but it was a voice filled with longing and recognition. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she swallowed them back so as not to frighten him. She smiled instead, whispering, "You did it. You spoke." Her voice was calm, steady, though her heart felt like it would burst. Daniel leaned into her arms, clutching her tightly. He repeated the word once more, as though it was the only one he knew how to say: "Mommy." Grace held him close, rocking gently as if he were her own. She knew he wasn't calling her his real mother, he was reaching for the feeling of comfort he had lost. In that moment, Grace understood what no therapy chart or expensive doctor had seen: what Daniel needed most was not drills or pressure, but love, the kind of love that let him feel safe enough to let his voice come forward. The commotion of the house carried on outside, unaware of the miracle that had just taken place upstairs. Only when Mrs. Wilson peeked in to check on them did the news begin to spread. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she heard Daniel's fragile voice repeat, "Mommy." The sound echoed like a bell through the mansion. For years, no one had heard his voice. Within minutes, whispers turned into exclamations among the staff. Some were in disbelief, some rushed to witness it for themselves. Grace tried to shield Daniel from the sudden crowding at the door, keeping him close to her chest. The boy clung tighter, burying his face against her, still murmuring the word as though afraid it would vanish if he stopped. Word traveled fast, and Mr. Carter was called home immediately. He stormed into the mansion in his suit, confusion and urgency in his eyes. "What is this I hear?" he demanded. The staff fell silent as he rushed upstairs. When he entered the room, he stopped short. Daniel was in Grace's arms, his tiny voice repeating softly, "Mommy! Mommy!" Mr. Carter's face crumpled, torn between shock and disbelief. For years he had longed to hear his son speak. He had spent fortunes on experts, flown to other countries for special treatments, yet nothing had worked. And now, here, in the arms of a nanny, his son's first word had emerged. He stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Daniel." The boy looked at him for a moment, then buried himself deeper into Grace's embrace. Mr. Carter's throat tightened. It hurt him to see his son call someone else that word, yet at the same time, he could not deny the miracle before him. Tears welled in his eyes, ones he tried desperately to hide but could not. He turned away for a moment, pressing a hand to his face. Grace held Daniel firmly but gently. She spoke softly to Mr. Carter, her voice calm, "He is not confusing me with his mother. He is calling out for the feeling of love he remembers." That is what opened his voice. Mr. Carter swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He sat down on the edge of the rug, close but not too close, his hands resting helplessly on his knees. For the first time in years, he looked not like a powerful businessman, but like a father longing to reach his child. Daniel peeked out from Grace's arms, eyes landing on his father. There was a long silence. Then, he placed his toy car on the floor and gently rolled it toward his father. It was a gesture, simple yet filled with meaning. Mr. Carter's lips trembled as he picked up the car and rolled it back. Daniel's lips curved upward just slightly, but enough to be a smile. Grace sat between them, watching the fragile bridge form. She knew this was only the beginning, but beginnings had power. She also knew things would not be easy. People might question her role, whisper that the boy had bonded with the wrong person. Yet in her heart, she understood love was not about ownership, it was about healing. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep with the music box beside him, Grace sat in her small room, notebook open, hands shaking as she wrote, "Today first word. He said mommy. 3 times. In my arms. Reached out to father with toy car. A new path has begun." She closed the notebook, pressing it against her chest, her tears finally falling freely. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, God. Thank you for trusting me with this moment." She did not know what tomorrow would bring: questions, doubts, maybe even conflict, but she knew this: Daniel's voice had finally broken the silence. And no matter what, that was a victory that no one could ever take away. The news of Daniel's first spoken word spread through the mansion like fire on dry grass. Some staff were amazed, whispering about the miracle they had witnessed. Others questioned it, saying maybe Grace had tricked the boy or planted the word in his mind. The house, once quiet and stiff, was now buzzing with opinions. Grace kept herself calm in the middle of it all. She didn't care for the whispers, her focus was on Daniel, who had finally opened his lips to speak. But the moment of joy was also filled with uncertainty. Mr. Carter, though deeply moved, struggled with complicated feelings. To him, Daniel's first word should have been spoken to his father. Instead, it had been to Grace, the nanny. In his heart, he felt gratitude but also a pinch of jealousy. He had given his son the world, yet it was this humble woman who gave the boy his voice. That evening, when Grace brought Daniel to the dining room, a rare thing happened. Mr. Carter was already sitting at the long polished table, waiting. Normally, Daniel would avoid him, but this time, Grace gently guided him forward. She whispered softly, "It's okay, I'm right here." Daniel clung to her hand tightly, eyes darting around nervously. The room felt too large, too formal for such a small boy. Mr. Carter cleared his throat and said carefully, "Come here, Daniel." His voice trembled, trying to sound gentle though it had always been firm and commanding. Daniel hesitated but looked at Grace. She nodded with an encouraging smile, and slowly, step by step, the boy approached his father. Then, in an unexpected moment, Daniel placed his toy car on the table in front of his father and gave a tiny smile. Mr. Carter's hands shook slightly as he touched the car, sliding it back toward him. For the first time, father and son shared a game of giving and receiving, a silent bond forming. Grace stood quietly nearby, her heart swelling with relief. But not everyone celebrated. Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, confronted Grace later in the hallway. Her tone was sharp. "Don't think this changes your position here. The boy called you something he should not. You've confused him. Mr. Carter may thank you now, but soon he'll realize you're overstepping." Grace did not argue. She had no wish to fight. She only said, "I am here for the child, not for anyone's approval." Then she walked away, leaving Mrs. Wilson frowning behind her. In the days that followed, Daniel's progress continued slowly. He didn't speak new words yet, but he began making soft sounds when playing, humming back when Grace hummed, and sometimes even laughing quietly at little things. These tiny steps made Grace beam with pride. Still, Mr. Carter remained distant at times. He wanted to be included but didn't always know how. One evening, when Grace was reading Daniel a bedtime story, Mr. Carter walked in quietly. He stood at the door, watching his son leaning against Grace, listening intently. For a moment, he looked as if he might walk away, but then he stepped in. "May I read?" he asked softly. Grace looked at Daniel, giving him the choice. To her surprise, Daniel nodded. Mr. Carter's hands trembled slightly as he took the book. His voice cracked on the first sentence but grew steadier as he went on. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on him. It was awkward, imperfect, but it was a beginning. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the sight. Yet the challenges were not over. The next morning, when Mr. Carter's business partner came by for a meeting, he overheard staff talking about Daniel's first word. Curious, he asked bluntly in front of others, "So, your boy spoke at last? And he called the nanny mommy." His words were half teasing, half mocking. The air went heavy. Mr. Carter's jaw tightened, embarrassment flashing in his eyes. That night, he visited Grace privately. His voice was low, controlled. "I appreciate what you've done for Daniel, but this can't continue. He must understand you are not his mother." Grace looked at him calmly. "I never told him to call me that. It came from his heart. It isn't about me. It's about what he needs: love, safety, warmth. If you want him to stop, you must be the one to give him those things." Her words struck him, though he didn't admit it. He left silently, wrestling with his pride. 4 days afterward, he tried harder. He ate breakfast with Daniel, something he had never done before. He sat with him in the garden while Grace blew bubbles, awkwardly trying to join the laughter. He even cancelled one evening meeting to be home for bedtime, stumbling through another storybook reading. Daniel noticed. Though he still clung to Grace, he began to glance at his father more often, watching him with quiet curiosity. And one night, just before drifting off to sleep, he whispered something new, not to Grace this time, but to his father. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the music box. But Mr. Carter heard it. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his chest. Daniel had whispered, "Daddy." It was the moment Mr. Carter had longed for, and it softened something deep inside him. He turned away so Grace wouldn't see the tears slipping down his cheeks, but she noticed anyway. She smiled quietly, writing the moment later in her notebook. "Tonight, he said Daddy." Even so, not all was smooth. Some staff continued to question Grace's place in the mansion. Mrs. Wilson even suggested to Mr. Carter that maybe Daniel needed a professional therapist living in-house instead of a nanny. But Mr. Carter, shaken by the word Daddy still ringing in his ears, simply said, "Grace stays." Grace, however, was not concerned about her own position. Her only worry was Daniel's heart. She knew how fragile progress could be. If he felt pressured, he might close himself off again. So she kept steady, never rushing him, never demanding too much, always celebrating the small steps. The household atmosphere began to change. Where there had once been cold silence, there were now traces of laughter, small words, and gentle connections. Grace knew the journey was not complete. But she also knew one truth: the boy who had lived behind walls of silence was breaking free, one fragile word at a time. And though she feared storms ahead, she felt certain of this: love had already begun its quiet work, and the mansion was not the same as it had been weeks ago. The silence that once weighed down its walls had been replaced with something lighter. Small sounds filled the air now: the gentle hum of Grace's songs, Daniel's quiet laughter when bubbles floated by in the garden, the tapping games with blocks, and, most precious of all, the soft words he had begun to try. It was as if life had returned to a house that had been sleeping for years. Grace noticed these changes with joy, but she also remained careful. She knew how fragile progress could be. A single harsh moment, a single careless word, might make Daniel retreat into silence again. So, every day, she moved with patience, steady as the ticking of a clock. She knew Daniel trusted her, but now she also saw him slowly learning to trust his father. That gave her hope. One Saturday morning, Mr. Carter surprised everyone. Instead of leaving early for work, he came into the garden where Grace and Daniel were sitting. He carried no phone, no laptop, just himself. Daniel froze for a moment, uncertain, but Grace gave him a reassuring smile. Mr. Carter sat down awkwardly on the grass, his suit trousers gathering dust. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. Daniel looked at him, then at Grace, then pointed at the bubbles she was blowing. For the first time, he whispered one word to his father: "Bubble." It was faint, almost hidden in the breeze, but clear enough. Mr. Carter's eyes widened. Grace's heart soared. She kept blowing bubbles, giving father and son the space to find each other. Mr. Carter laughed gently, chasing one of the bubbles with his hand, pretending to miss it. Daniel giggled, a sound so rare and sweet it made Grace's eyes sting. The boy clapped his hands when a bubble landed on his father's nose before bursting. That simple game brought more healing than any expensive therapy ever had. In the days that followed, Mr. Carter changed. He still worked, but he began spending time with Daniel in small ways. Reading short stories at night. Eating one meal a day together. Sitting quietly in the boy's room just to be near him. Grace watched from the side, guiding gently when needed, stepping back when father and son found their own rhythm. The staff, once doubtful, started showing respect for Grace. Even Mrs. Wilson softened, though she rarely admitted it aloud. She noticed the boy smiling more, the way he reached out for Grace's hand but also looked for his father. One afternoon, Mrs. Wilson approached Grace and said quietly, "You've done something remarkable here." "I was wrong." Grace only nodded, her heart full of gratitude, but she didn't take pride in the praise. She knew this was Daniel's victory, not hers. The biggest test came one evening at a family gathering. Relatives and business partners were invited to the mansion. Everyone had heard whispers about Daniel's silence. Many came out of curiosity, not kindness. Grace worried about how Daniel would react to so many faces and voices in the same room. When the guests arrived, Daniel clung to her side. People looked at him, some pitying, some whispering. Grace stayed calm, holding his small hand gently. Mr. Carter noticed his son's fear and, for once, didn't hide behind pride. He bent down and whispered to Daniel, "It's all right. I'm here. Daddy's here." Daniel hesitated, then, to everyone's astonishment, whispered back, "Daddy." The room went silent. It was the first time many had heard his voice. Mr. Carter's eyes glistened, his hand tightening around his son's. Grace felt tears rise too. That one word silenced every doubt, every whisper. The boy who had been trapped in silence had found his voice, not just for her but for his father. After the guests left, Mr. Carter asked to speak with Grace privately. He looked tired but different, as though a weight had lifted. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've given my son something money never could. You've given him hope, and you've given me a chance to be his father again." Grace replied gently, all he needed was love and patience. He already had the ability inside him. He just needed to feel safe enough to let it out. For the first time, Mr. Carter bowed his head humbly. "You're part of this family now, Grace. Not just an employee. A part of us." Her eyes filled with quiet tears. She had never sought recognition, but hearing those words touched her deeply. She thought of her own children, grown and living their lives, and felt a sense of purpose that warmed her heart. From then on, the mansion was different. Daniel's laughter echoed through the halls. His words, though still few, came more often. He learned new ones slowly: book, car, yes, no, but to Grace and Mr. Carter, each one was like a precious gem. Every word carried the weight of years of silence being broken. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall windows, Daniel sat between his father and Grace, holding their hands. He whispered softly, "Family." It was not perfect, not loud, but it was true. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, while Mr. Carter squeezed his son's hand with all the love he had once struggled to show. Grace later wrote in her notebook, "Today he said family. The journey is not over, but he is free." She closed the book, knowing the boy who once lived in silence was stepping into a world full of words, love, and belonging. And in that quiet moment, she realized something: love had not only given Daniel a voice, it had healed a broken father, softened a cold house, and reminded her why she had chosen this work. Because love, no matter where it comes from, is the strongest language of all.